Hi everyone, this is Saveda from Zephyr Lake Carmelite Mission. Today I'm going to share with you my reflections on St. John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul. This is our second episode of the series, chapters 2 to 7 of first book. And in here, St. John of the Cross is sharing with us the imperfections of beginners who are just beginning their spiritual journey, and he uses the seven capital sins or seven capital vices. All he's trying to do is caution and help beginners realize that they're still on a journey and they have not attained perfection yet. And also he alerts us beginners so that we can correct our faults and our imperfections, and also be ready to accept the dark night when it does happen to us. And what are the seven capital sins or the seven capital vices? It's pride, avarice, lust, anger, gluttony, envy, and sloth. So we'll start with pride. So typically the beginners are usually very fervent, they're diligent in their spiritual exercises, but they don't like to be corrected. So when the spiritual director, as an example, tries to correct them, they want to change the spiritual director. They don't like to hear the praise of others, or if they praise others, they would try to detract, and even in their confessions, they will try to minimize their faults, or on the other extreme, they'll try to be too harsh on themselves because they think they are such saints already that even their small faults, they will be very hard on themselves. And they will confess their sins in such a way that they will want the confessor to think highly of them. And and if confessors or spiritual directors try to correct them, they will try to find a different spiritual director or confessor. So not having that humility, but being vain to appear holy before others. And often they like to speak about spiritual things in others' presence, and they like to instruct others rather than to be instructed themselves. And they would find occasions to condemn others for their lack of devotion, or they do not want anyone except themselves to appear holy. So they will condemn others so that they themselves can be exalted. Kind of like the example that Jesus himself gives in Luke chapter 18 about the Pharisee and how he puts down the publican, the sinner who is contrite, and he praises himself that he's not like the publican. On the other hand, people who are advanced, the souls that are advanced, they will usually be very humble, very tranquil, and they'll have a docility of spirit. And usually they will serve others rather than themselves, and they will rather be receiving instructions for themselves than trying to instruct others. And they will always consider and think everyone else is better than themselves. And they grow in fervor because they feel thankful to God, and they attribute all their good works, their virtues, and their holiness as a gift from God, as a grace from God. So that would be the difference between a person who is a beginner and an advanced soul in terms of the first capital sin, that is pride. The next one St. John of the Cross shares is of avarice. And here he speaks of spiritual avarice, where the person the beginner who will experience this vice will never be content with the spirit God has given them. They're on a journey and they're at a given point, and they will not be content with and thankful and grateful for what spiritual gifts God has given them. Instead, they will be very much seeking for more. They want to receive counsel from many people, and even the counsel they receive, they will be judgmental about it. and they will want to learn more and more and more, but really without actually applying any of that into their own life. So that is kind of an avarice, spiritual avarice. And he says, don't strive, to do that. Instead, strive for interior poverty and for mortification. Look for occasions of mortification and interior poverty. Another attribute that you would find in a beginner is the overly attached to the ornate spiritual objects and possessive and attached with them, and depending more on the exterior spiritual objects rather than the interior mortification and interior recollection of soul. On the other hand, a truly advanced soul will have a true devotion for God from the heart and looks only to these spiritual ornate objects as a means to the substance represented, that is God himself who is represented in those objects. And their eyes are fixed solely only upon God and on being the friends of God, and intent on pleasing God alone, and living and longing for God alone, and even loving others for love of God, and placing God above everything else. And God places these souls that are in this kind of a docile spirit in the passive purgation or the dark night, so that he can further remedy their imperfections and faults and get them ready for the divine union. And the next capital sin that St. John of the Cross speaks of is lust. So spiritual lust is also there when people are, even during prayer or even while receiving the sacraments, the beginners can experience impurity in the sensory part as well as in the soul. And since their desire to pray is like a gratification of their own senses, even their spiritual exercises can be performed for the sensory satisfaction. And they might even experience disquiet and disturbances while praying. And if they experience that, they might give up and they don't experience the gratification or the satisfactions from these spiritual exercises. They may even give up prayer. They may abandon prayer and the good works because of discouragement. And they may have like a vain satisfaction in spiritual conversations and works. And when certain people are present, they might actually speak more, have more of those spiritual conversations. And they may have some special liking for certain individuals, and not out of pure spiritual love of God, but also like an inordinate attachment, inordinate affection. And sometimes that leads to a greater intensity in their life, that their love of God grows cold, and the inordinate affection takes over even their spiritual life. And later, or in parallel, this might even lead them to further disquietude, remorse of conscience, and dissatisfaction with themselves. And they might abandon their prayer life and their journey in union, for union with God. So in the dark night, God himself purifies our love that we experience for each other and for the created world. And God sets all things in the proper order. Like what is more important is how we love others. We love everyone for the love of God. So God purifies those our tendencies when we go through the dark night. The next capital sin or capital vices that St. John of the Cross speaks of is anger. And in fact, this morning in the audience, the papal audience, Pope Francis spoke of this very thing. And I think everybody should take some time to go and watch the papal audience on the Vatican website, vatican.va. So like for beginners, we are easily angered when we are not in a state of recollection. So when we are in a state of recollection, we are like saints. But when we are not in a state of recollection, we get easily irritated, annoyed, and angered, and we could experience anger over the sins of others, that is spiritual anger. And we can become impatient and angry over others, and their imperfections can be magnified. Our own faults will be minimized, and we keep talking about them. And that is also not a good, it takes away the recollection of the soul that's essential for the union with God. And we're unable to, we'll make all kinds of resolutions, but we will never be able to keep up any of them because, we will easily give up. And we will have a lack of spiritual meekness that is necessary to wait on God to give us the virtues that we need and that we desire in His own time. So we get impatient with ourselves and angry with ourselves unnecessarily instead of being meek and open and waiting for God Himself to instill those virtues in us. And the next one is gluttony. In gluttony, spiritual gluttony, it can be an imperfection in beginners because the spiritual delight that we experience in the spiritual exercises can cause us to become immoderate. That is excess. We might go into excessive spirituality. So also we could have a lack of spiritual purity. So we're no longer doing these prayer and spiritual exercises for love of God, but for the satisfaction. And we might have a lack of discretion, and we go into extremes, like too many penances, too many fasts, and doing fasts and penances to such an excess, and without getting any counsel from spiritual director. In fact, we have some who might even hide penances from their spiritual directors because they're so full of self-will, and they perform penance in disobedience to the counsel of the spiritual directors. And this is spiritual gluttony and is also a form of pride. And we know virtue always lies in the middle. It is in moderation and in obedience. And so so that is also something that we need to watch for, is spiritual gluttony. And, and we might even make excuses for why we are so self-willed, and we know that the only way we can experience union with God is when our will is erased and God's will becomes a priority. The beginners will find satisfaction only in their own self-willed spiritual exercises and penances. And if they cannot do those things, they feel dissatisfied. The next one here is envy. And I think then we have one more, and we'll be done with today's video. Spiritual envy is being sad about the spiritual gifts and holiness of others. So we are unable to bear when others are being praised for their holiness, for their virtues. We become envious of other people's virtue. Even so, we might even try to discredit them, others, in order to prove the persons who are being praised are unworthy of those praises. And, that is envy. And we get annoyed with people who are being praised for their holiness and for their virtues. And we could get annoyed with our own selves for the lack of those virtues that we see in others. And for our own imperfections, we might become too hard on ourselves. So that is also called spiritual envy, and we need to watch out for that as beginners. And then next one is sloth. Sloth, I believe, is the last one. That is, when we don't receive sensory satisfaction, we give up prayer, not realizing that that is the right time for us. Maybe we are going to enter into the dark night of the soul. Instead, we flee from spiritual exercises that are not delightful to the senses. So we do the opposite. So this is a good warning for us that we should not give up prayer, even if we don't experience any sensory satisfaction. And, stopping on our journey when we are very close to passing through the dark night of the soul, because that is essential. That dark night is essential for the passive purification that God Himself wants to instill in us. And, we have to align our will to God's will. And So that is, so it's very important to be conscious of these things. And the reason St. John of the Cross speaks of the 7 vices is to create an awareness in beginners of these faults and imperfections, so that we will recognize them and be able to give them up. And so we will allow God to accomplish in us, through the dark night, a higher level of transformation that is not possible through human effort alone. And it can only be produced by God through the passive night, who transforms our senses and our soul and makes it conform more radically to his will by infusing virtues that we need to lead us to that union with God that awaits us. So that is all for today. This is our second video on the Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. I hope you have a blessed weekend ahead in a few days. And also in February, I will have 2 more videos. And that's kind of our topic for this year, 2024. Thank you and have a blessed day, everyone.